You wake up, no alarm. The sun's already up over the ridge, and for a second you just lie there, deciding whether today feels like a hunting day. There's no calendar on the wall with a little red circle around Saturday. There's no group chat asking if anyone's still on for tonight. There's just you, your body, and a decision nobody else is going to make for you. Meanwhile, 50,000 years in the future, someone is staring at a Monday morning inbox with 47 unread emails, physically incapable of deciding anything until they've had coffee and reread the subject lines twice. Somewhere in between those two mornings, humanity invented the concept of just 5 more minutes and then built an entire economy around ignoring it. So here's the actual question. Did ancient humans have days off, or is day off a concept that only makes sense once someone's invented the kind of job you'd need a break from in the first place? Let's start with the version of this story that everyone's heard, because it's a wild claim once you say it out loud. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee spent time with the Juhansi, a sand community living in the Kalahari Desert, and tracked exactly how many hours they spent finding food. His number came out to somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week. That figure came out of a 1966 gathering at the University of Chicago called Man the Hunter, where Lee and a handful of other anthropologists presented their field data on living hunter-gatherer societies. It wasn't meant as a viral factoid at the time. It was just a number in a conference paper. It became something much bigger almost by accident. Here's the thing, nobody tells you that's less than half of a standard 40-hour work week. A hunter-gatherer with no supermarket, no refrigeration, no backup plan if the hunt failed, was spending less time getting food than a modern office worker spends in meetings that could have been an email. An anthropologist named Marshall Salins took that data and ran with it, coining the phrase the original Affluent society in a now famous 1966 essay. His argument wasn't that hunter-gatherers were poor and struggling. It was the opposite. Because they wanted so little compared to us and got it so efficiently, they were, by his logic, wealthier in time than almost anyone alive today. Sit with that for a second. Wealthier in time, not in stuff, in hours they got to keep. So what did they do with the rest of the week? Lee's own notes describe long stretches of visiting relatives, storytelling, resting in the shade, elaborate multi-day trance-healing dances, and what can only be described as an enormous amount of just sitting around talking, not lazy, just done for the day, and comfortable with that being enough. Picture that dance for a second, because it's not a quiet, polite little gathering. These healing dances could run through an entire night, the whole community singing and clapping in rotating shifts, while a few chosen healers worked themselves into an altered state, meant to draw out sickness from anyone who needed it. That's not a coffee break. That's a full night shift dedicated to something with zero economic output whatsoever, and nobody there thought that was a waste of time. Try explaining to your manager that you need Thursday off for a trance-healing dance and see how that conversation goes. But here's the problem. This story got repeated so often in so many documentaries that it slowly hardened into a kind of myth. And myths, no matter how comforting, eventually attract someone determined to poke holes in them. Later researchers went back through Lee's methodology and noticed something. His famous hours only counted time spent actively hunting or gathering. It didn't count the walk to the hunting grounds. It didn't count butchering the kill. It didn't count processing plant food into something edible, which for some staples took hours on its own. It didn't count childcare, or making and repairing tools, or building shelter. Add all of that back in, and the real number climbs. Some later estimates put total workload for hunter-gatherer societies closer to 40 to 44 hours a week, once every task connected to survival gets counted, not just the glamorous hunting and gathering part. Which means the original affluent society wasn't necessarily working less. It was working differently, in a way that didn't look like clocking into an office and got mistaken for barely working at all. There's a strange twist buried in more recent research, too. A biologist named Herman Poncer spent time measuring actual energy expenditure among the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, using the same metabolic tracking methods used on modern athletes. His findings, published in the 2010s, showed something nobody expected. Despite being active all day, every day, the Hadza weren't burning dramatically more total calories than sedentary office workers back in the industrialized world. Sit with that one too. All that walking, digging, climbing, and the body, it turns out, adjusts its other internal processes to compensate. So total daily energy burned stays similar across wildly different lifestyles. Busy doesn't necessarily mean burning more, it just means burning differently. So, which version is true? Honestly, probably both, depending on which hours you're counting and which season you're standing in. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, though. Even the 40-plus hours a week critique still misses something modern work doesn't have. There was no boss deciding when you did those hours. No shift schedule. No clocking in at 9, If it rained, you didn't gather. If someone got sick, the group adjusted. The work was real, but it bent around life instead of the other way around. Compare that to your actual job, which doesn't care that you didn't sleep well, or that it's your birthday, or that the weather outside is spectacular. Your job has never once looked outside and said, you know what, actually take today. And this flexibility mattered more than people give it credit for because it didn't survive the next big shift in human history. Once agriculture took over, work stopped bending around life quite so easily. Crops don't care if you're tired. A field needs weeding on its own schedule, not yours, and a herd of animals needs feeding every single day, holidays very much included. Some researchers studying the transition to farming have argued that early agricultural life may have demanded more total hours with less flexibility to skip a day than the hunting and gathering lifestyle it replaced. Which means, in a strange way, the moment humanity invented civilization, we may have also invented working weekends before anyone had gotten around to inventing the weekend itself. There's another layer to this that Lee's own data captured, even if it rarely makes it into the popular retelling. The hours he measured weren't flat across the whole year. Effort rose and fell with the seasons, heavier during dry stretches when food was harder to find, lighter during periods of natural abundance, when the same number of stomachs needed less searching to fill. Rest, in that world, wasn't a fixed weekly allowance. It was something the environment itself handed out, generously in good months, sparingly in lean ones. Compare that to a modern calendar, which grants you the exact same 2 days off in the middle of a brutal January as it does in the easiest week of June. It doesn't matter what the actual world around you is doing, your body doesn't get a vote, the grid does. Now here's something that genuinely surprises most people about days off specifically. The very idea of a fixed recurring rest day isn't a modern invention either. Ancient Babylonian calendars included a concept called the Shabbatu, a day tied to the lunar cycle, generally landing on the full moon, associated with rest and ritual completion. Some scholars connect this directly to the much later concept of the Sabbath. This wasn't a suggestion. In some Mesopotamian traditions, certain activities were considered inappropriate on that day. The same way a lot of modern cultures still treat Sunday just a few thousand years earlier and tied to the moon instead of a fixed 7-day cycle. Rest, in other words, wasn't just something that happened when the work ran out. In some places, it got scheduled directly into the sky itself. So the idea of you get one guaranteed day where you're allowed to stop might be thousands of years older than anyone clocking a 9 to 5. And the shape of that guaranteed stop wasn't universal either. Ancient Rome ran on an 8-day cycle called the nundinal cycle, with the 8th day set aside as a market day, a break from ordinary agricultural labor when farmers came into town to trade. Ancient Egypt divided its calendar into 10-day weeks instead, called decans, with the final day functioning as a kind of built-in pause before the next stretch began. None of these cultures agreed on how long a week should even be. 7 days, 8 days, 10 days, all coexisting at different points in history, all solving the exact same problem. People need a predictable point where the labor stops, whether or not the actual math behind it matches what we now consider normal. The specific number 7 that most of the world eventually settled on has its own separate strange backstory. It's tied to ancient Babylonian astrology and the 7 visible moving objects in the night sky, the sun, the moon, and 5 planets, each one eventually getting assigned its own day. We've been arguing about the shape of the week for so long that we invented entire phrases just to mark our feelings about specific points inside it. Hump Day, TGIF. Nobody in ancient Mesopotamia needed a nickname for Wednesday. The moon told them when to stop, and that was that. Here's the twist that reframes the whole question. The 40-hour work week you're currently living inside of, weekends included, is barely a century old. Henry Ford's company standardized a 5-day 40-hour week for factory workers in 1926, partly because he'd realized exhausted workers made more mistakes and bought fewer products on their day off. Before that, in early industrial factories, 60, 70, even 100-hour work weeks weren't unusual. Children included in a lot of cases, which is the kind of detail that makes a hunter-gatherer's flexible 15 to 40-hour week look downright luxurious by comparison. Which means the specific shape of days off you're currently annoyed about not having enough of was itself invented by a car company trying to sell more cars. Not out of kindness, out of the very practical realization that an exhausted person is a terrible customer and an even worse employee. Ford wasn't running a charity, he was running the math, and the math said rested workers built better cars and had actual money left over to go buy one. So who had it better? A hunter-gatherer with no clock but a full, physically demanding week of survival tasks, or a factory worker in 1890 with a fixed schedule and almost no rest at all? Or you, right now with a calendar app that pings you about a meeting you already know is happening. There's no clean winner here. What's interesting is how differently each era defined off for the Juhansi rest wasn't a reward you earned after enough labor. It was just what happened once the immediate need was met, whenever that was on whatever day that turned out to be. Modern rest is scheduled, earned, and constantly monitored, right down to apps that track whether you're relaxing correctly, buzzing to remind you that you haven't closed your meditation ring in 3 days. There's something almost funny about needing a notification to tell you that you're failing at doing nothing. Ancient rest just happened when the food was in and nobody was hungry yet. There was no ring to close. There was just an actual physical absence of anything urgent left to do, which is a different feeling than technically off the clock but still checking Slack. That's a different relationship with time. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just built on a different question. Instead of asking, have I worked my required hours yet? The question was closer to, is there anything left that needs doing right now? Turns out a lot of the time, the honest answer was no. Worth noting that the word burnout itself, the modern shorthand for chronic overwork, wasn't even coined until 1974 by a psychologist named Herbert Freudenberger. He used it to describe what he was seeing in overworked clinic staff, an entire psychological condition common enough now to have its own merchandise and self-help aisle, didn't have a name for most of human history. Not because nobody ever felt that way before, because the specific grinding, unrelenting structure that produces it hadn't fully existed yet, at least not for most people most of the time. And maybe that's the actual difference worth sitting with, more than the hours themselves. It's not that ancient humans were smarter about rest or somehow more enlightened about work-life balance before either phrase existed. It's that the question of when to stop used to live inside the day itself, not inside a calendar invented by someone who never met you and never will. A hunter-gatherer didn't need a wellness app to grant permission to rest. The permission was built into the actual physical state of having enough food for now. Once that box was checked, there wasn't a second box asking whether you'd also hit your step count, answered your messages, or made yourself available in case something came up. There was just the rest of the afternoon, unclaimed by anyone. So the next time you're staring down a Sunday evening dreading Monday's inbox, there's a version of humanity, not that long ago in evolutionary terms, that never had to invent the concept of dreading a specific day at all. Not because they had more time than you, because nobody had built a calendar yet that could tell them exactly how much of it they were supposed to be unhappy about. Every hour anyone has ever rested was borrowed from whatever the day allowed, long before anyone drew a box around a week and decided which parts of it you were allowed to enjoy.